Long before Stevie Nicks' success in the United States, or any rumors of their ongoing drama, Fleetwood Mac was a band known for its electric blues rock, eccentric personalities, and talented musicians. This is Sound of History, and this is the beginning of Fleetwood Mac. I know you like Fleetwood Mac a lot.
How do you know that?
You've talked about it a lot. Do you know much about like their story and who they were or are, I guess?
Not really.
Cool. So this will be, do you know much about them pre-Stevie?
There was a Fleetwood Mac pre-Stevie?
Oh yeah, about 10 years almost.
No, I did not know that.
Well, that's what part one is about. Michael John Kells Fleetwood was born in Cornwall, England in 1947. He was the second child, and his older sister was an actress who unfortunately passed away from cancer in 1995. He was a typical army brat child, and his dad was in the Royal Air Force, so they moved around quite a bit. They actually spent like 6 years in Egypt and then moved to Norway, where Mick started to go to school and became fluent in Norwegian. He was described as an intelligent kid, but did not flourish in an academic setting, which I think is true of a lot of
Creatives.
Yeah, a lot of the rock stars we've talked about, that is the case. He was too imaginative, and by the time he was old enough to go to British boarding schools...
What do we mean by too imaginative? Who's like, sorry, this kid's not good at school. He's too imaginative. Like, your school is too unimaginative. What are you talking about? So dumb.
By the time he was old enough to go to British boarding schools, he had a really hard time doing well there. When he was 13, his parents somehow recognized that he might have a future in music, so they bought him his first drum set.
Good job, parents.
Pretty soon after that, Mick gave up on an academic life and focused solely on music. With his parents' blessing, he dropped out of school at 15 and moved to London, staying with his sister in order to try and make it as a drummer. Which is very young to get your parents' blessing to drop out of school and move to the biggest city.
It helps if you're living with your sister.
True. And probably also helps that, she was an actress, so she was probably already pursuing that creative life. So
yeah.
She kind of like broke the ice a bit. For a few years, Mick played the London club circuit, not really finding a place to fit in terms of like a more permanent position. His first band was a group called the Cheyennes, which he was asked to join basically because he lived near the band's frontman. The Cheyennes also opened for the Rolling Stones in some of the Stones' like earlier gigs.
Wow.
Yeah. But that band was already fizzling out when Mick joined, so he bounced around a bit more after that one. What do you think about the Cheyennes as a name? Where do you rank that one? I know how you feel about ranking band names.
I am very neutral on that.
It's a very neutral name. There's really not a lot going on to it. Not bad, not good.
Yeah.
All right, that's fair. So about 5 or 6 out of 10.
5.
Cool.
I'm smack in the middle.
Yeah, that's a 5.
Fine.
Mick ended up in a band called Shotgun Express. How do you feel about that name?
Way better.
Really? Okay, so that's like a 7, 8?
7.
Okay. So he ended up in Shotgun Express with a guy named Peter Green, who's a big... Remember that name?
I remember that name. I was going to say I already knew that name.
You do?
Somehow.
Okay.
Very familiar name.
Yeah, okay. Eventually, Peter Green left to join John Mayall's Blues Breakers, which also featured a guy named John McVie. Or McVie, I'm not really sure how to say that.
I know that name.
So, yeah, remember those 3 guys. You got their names?
Yeah.
What are they?
Peter, Christine McVie's husband. Are you calling him Mick or Nick?
Mick with an M. Because his name is Michael, I think.
Oh, okay.
That band's drummer left in 1967, and Mick was asked to take his place. Mick said about that drummer who left, this is in the Blues Breakers, which Peter Green and John McVie are currently in.
Okay.
But Mick is just now being asked to join. So Mick said about the drummer that left the Blues Breakers, quote, technically he's in a whole different league than I am, but he was probably getting a bit too clever. The band didn't want any more drum solos, so he was out and I was in, end quote. That decision didn't really go down well with the audience that started to chant for the old drummer every single night.
Yeah, I'm sure if you go from something really cool to something that's like, you know,
just basic.
Like, yeah, just basic. They'd be like, what the hell?
When the crowd started to chant for the old drummer every night, John McVie would go to the mic and tell them to shut up.
That sounds about right.
That started a friendship that would eventually sustain Fleetwood Mac through some pretty tough times. Eventually, Peter Green left the Blues Breakers to start his own band, and he took Mick and John with him. And that's the band that eventually became Fleetwood Mac. Peter called the band Fleetwood Mac, taking Mick's last name and part of John's last name. At the start of it, Peter was the star of the band, because he had received acclaim for his work with the Blues Breakers, and that he is just kind of like the biggest name at that point.
It's so wild that, like, you know, Fleetwood Mac is like a phrase. It's a thing.
Yeah.
It's a name. It's a title.
Yeah.
And it's so funny that, like, at one point they were just like, huh.
Yeah.
That, like, that, it's just so funny.
But initially, they were billed as Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac.
Oh, stop it.
But Peter never agreed to that billing, and he hated that his name was added to the moniker.
Okay.
He said later, quote, well, I pretty much felt that one day I would leave, and I wanted Mick and John to have a band, end quote.
Who starts a band being like, I'm going to leave? What are you doing?
I mean, he did.
It's just weird.
Yeah. So I think now's the time where we should go backwards and talk about John McVie. John McVie, I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong. It's just that's how it's spelled. Sometimes I think it's McVie, but it's MC. So I say Mick. John McVie was born in West London in 1945. He started playing the trumpet when he was really young, but switched to the guitar when he was about 13, playing in local school bands, mostly doing cover songs of bands like The Shadows. But since all of his friends were already learning how to play lead guitar, he decided he'd switch to the bass instead. Smart business move.
Smart business move.
Everyone's already playing the guitar. Switch to the one that'll get you a job. At first, he just removed 2 strings on his guitar, but his dad bought him a pink Fender bass, which was the same one used by his biggest influence, the bassist of The Shadows.
That's so awesome. Look at all these supportive dads
Yeah.
in this episode. This is fantastic.
It worked out. Their sons made millions. So John left school at 17 and trained for a long time to be a tax inspector. You know, rock band, tax inspector.
That doesn't give the same vibe.
Around that same time, John Mayall started to put together a Chicago blues-style band. John auditioned and was offered a job as the Blues Breakers bassist.
Nice.
For a while, John kept his day job while playing with them before eventually deciding to focus on music full-time. John initially had no idea how to play blues and learned from B.B. King records that Mayall gave to him. He was tenacious and dedicated as a musician. Peter Green, in 1966, was asked to join the Blues Breakers after their previous lead guitarist, Eric Clapton, left.
That's funny.
Yeah. For Peter Green's birthday, Mayall gave him some free recording time. So Peter invited John and Mick to join him, and they recorded 3 singles, which could be said to be like one of the earliest examples of Fleetwood Mac. Peter Green also knew that they needed to fill out their sound some more on stage, and he heard about this guitarist named Jeremy Spencer, who had a specialty for the slide guitar. He fit in well with the group and officially joined. Jeremy was a massive hit with the audiences, who loved his raucous onstage antics and his blues guitar playing. Fleetwood Mac found instant success with their first album. It was a self-titled blues rock album released in 1968. The album reached number 4, even though no songs were released as singles. After they recorded their second album, Peter started to think that Jeremy's contribution to the sound was too narrow. He was basically only doing his slide guitar thing, so Peter wanted to add another guitarist to bring more to the group. Peter also wanted to take the band away from the traditional blues sound. Mick suggested an 18-year-old fan named Danny Kerwin.
That's a interesting way to go.
Yep. Danny would often show up to their shows, offer to carry gear and jam with Peter after soundcheck. Mick said, quote, Danny was a huge fan of Peter's. He would see us every chance he got, usually watching in awe from the front row, end quote. So Danny was asked to join and was astonished and delighted at the offer.
That's adorable.
Yeah, as you would be, an 18-year-old getting to join your favorite musician's band. Like, that's pretty cool.
Dude.
In November of 1968, with Danny now in the band, they released a song called Albatross that became their first #1 single. Peter later said that the success of Albatross was thanks to Danny. He said, quote, if it wasn't for Danny, I would never have had a #1 hit record, end quote. Around this time, John McVie became infatuated with Christine Perfect,
Christine,
who was a member of the band Chicken Shack. How do you
feel?
Good. Good name?
Like 9 out of 10.
She also sang on Fleetwood's second album, but like not as a member of the band, just kind of
there.
Yeah. The two dated for about 2 weeks before getting married in 1969.
I can't.
With Peter Green as the best man. So
2 weeks?
Yeah. So the band just kind of continued on for a while, releasing albums and touring in America. They struggled to find a record label, and the Beatles wanted them for their new label, but their manager decided on Warner Brothers, which the band has been with ever since.
That's impressive.
Yeah. In the late 1960s, Mick fell in love with a model named Jenny Boyd, as we all do.
Yeah. It's just whether or not they fall in love with you back.
Yeah. Jenny's sister was married to George Harrison, the Beatle, and would later be married to Eric Clapton.
All right.
I think her name was Patty Boyd. So Mick and Jenny got married in 1970. But 1970 was a very rough time for the band. Peter Green, along the way, had got heavily addicted to LSD, and his mental health problems were quickly becoming an issue. He started wearing long robes and preaching against the dangers of money.
I don't see how that's a problem.
He wanted to give all of the band's earnings to charity, which was vetoed by the other members.
I do see how it's a problem now.
He announced that he'd be leaving the band in May of 1970. At his last show with the group, they went past their allotted time, so the venue cut the power on them.
Oh.
But even still, Mick just kept on drumming with the power out.
That's sweet.
They didn't want it to end. They didn't want their band with Peter Green to end.
Man.
After leaving, Peter was diagnosed with drug-induced schizophrenia and spent a lot of time in psychiatric hospitals and undergoing electroconvulsive therapy. In later years, Mick felt really guilty about Peter's state. He said, quote, maybe we could have seen something that could have helped, not to keep him in the band, but to help this person through the beginnings of a very emotional ride that really he's still on as we speak.
Yeah, dang.
He did eventually have a bit of a career resurgence and played on a few albums and started a blues band in the late 90s.
Good.
He said in 1988, quote, I'm at present recuperating from treatment for taking drugs. It was drugs that influenced me a lot. I took more than I intended to. I took LSD 8 or 9 times. The effect of that stuff lasts so long. I wanted to give away all my money. I went kind of holy. No, not holy, religious. I thought I could do it. I thought I was all right on drugs, end quote.
That's like, you know, like, all right, yeah.
In July of 2020, Peter Green passed away in his sleep. There was no official cause of death listed. But back in 1970, when Peter stepped away from the group, they were in a bit of a turmoil. He was their principal songwriter and lead singer, so for a time they contemplated just breaking up.
Right.
I mean, after all, it was Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. Like, what are you...
No, it wasn't.
What are you
He said
about?
that it wasn't. He was mad about that.
For their next album, Jeremy Spencer, the slide guitar guy,
Mm-hmm.
he took over as the band's creative leader. but he was also deep in his own drug addiction. Christine, John's wife, was doing really well as a solo artist. She was twice voted England's best female vocalist.
Wow.
Yeah.
She is. But I'm kidding.
She officially joined the band in 1970, just as she was leaving Chicken Shack. While they were on tour in 1971, Jeremy Spencer said he was going to get a magazine. He left the hotel and never came back.
What happened?
He had become super disillusioned with his life in Fleetwood Mac and thought that he sounded horrible on recordings.
No.
The band found him a few days later, where he told them that he had joined the Children of God, which was a religious cult, and would not be working with the band anymore.
Okay, well, I thought that he killed himself.
No.
Joining a cult came out of left field.
Yep, welcome to Fleetwood Mac. It's just what happens.
Okay.
Jeremy, after leaving, went on to work with the cult for quite a long time. The band held auditions to replace him and hired Bob Welch without ever actually playing with him. They hired him just based on some recordings that they heard. Christine and Danny Kerwin, remember him? Wanted to push the band more into mainstream rock, which they did with their next album. Released in 1971, it was their fifth album and the first to not make the charts. But it did open them up to a new audience in America. Around this time, touring started to put a strain on relationships.
No, a strain in Fleetwood Mac's relationships?
Danny Kerwin started to get heavily dependent on alcohol, which started to create friction between him and new guitarist Bob. Bob knew that Danny was a super talented musician, but Bob was super outgoing and Danny was very withdrawn. Bob said later about Danny, quote, "Danny wasn't a very lighthearted person, to say the least. He probably shouldn't have been drinking as much as he did, even at his young age. He was always very intense about his work, as I was, but he didn't seem to ever be able to distance himself from it and laugh about it," end quote. In the midst of all of this, they released their sixth album that was composed almost entirely by Danny.
Wow, Danny.
Before a show in August of 1972, Bob and Danny got into an argument backstage while Danny was very drunk. Danny smashed his guitar, refused to go on stage, and started to heavily criticize the band. So they had to fire him.
Yeah.
It was later very clear that the stress of being essentially the creative leader of Fleetwood Mac really got to Danny, and he had a bit of a breakdown.
You don't say.
I would say quite a bit of a breakdown, actually. Mick said in 1976, quote, "It was a torment for him, really, to be up there on stage. It was more a thing of, although he was asked to leave, the way I was looking at it was, I hoped it was almost putting him out of his agony," end quote. Bob thought that they had put up with him for too long and only kept him around because Mick and McVie saw him as Peter's protege.
Screw Bob. What's Bob doing here?
Through the 70s, Danny started a couple of other bands and released solo albums. None of his solo stuff was commercially successful, partly because he was completely reluctant to play live or tour at all. He recorded his last solo album in 1979 and did nothing else in the music industry. In the 80s and 90s, he spent some time dealing with homelessness. During a 1980 Fleetwood Mac show in London, he showed up at their hotel. Mick said, quote, "It was heartbreaking. He looked derelict. He told us he'd slept on a park bench the night before."
Oh my gosh.
A newspaper interviewed him, and he said, quote, "I've been through a bit of a rough patch, but I'm not too bad. I get by. I suppose I am homeless, but then I've never really had a home since our early days on tour," end quote. Like, this is the story of so many people like him who weren't in Fleetwood Mac.
Right. Yeah.
Like, and this is the story of so many people in successful bands if they weren't in those bands.
Yeah.
This is their path. He just happened to do both, so we know about him because he was in Fleetwood Mac.
That's wild.
So many people
poor thing.
have gone through this. In 1994, his ex-wife said that he was disconnected from reality and living a simple life. In June of 2018, Danny passed away in his sleep.
Okay.
His ex-wife said he contracted pneumonia earlier that year and never fully recovered from it.
Okay.
He was 68 years old.
Okay. Wow.
Mick said, quote, "I cared for Danny a lot, and I care for his legacy. Danny was a quantum leap ahead of us creatively. He was a hugely important part of the band, end quote. Back in 1972, the band was looking for a new guitarist and a new creative leader. They added Bob Weston. He was a well-known session musician in the London blues scene. He had regularly played the same billings as Fleetwood Mac, so the group knew who he was and knew his talent. On their next few albums, he played a large role with his guitar work, writing some songs, and even singing a duet with Christine. Their 8th studio album featured his song Hypnotized, which was one of the band's most successful songs in the U.S. During the 1973 tour, the new guy, Bob Weston, had an affair with Mick Fleetwood's wife. That devastated Mick, and the rest of the shows had to be canceled. After their last show, the band told their sound engineer that they'd be splitting up. Mick said he could no longer work with Bob Weston. So,
just don't hire Bobs.
Yeah, the band decided to drop Bob Weston in order to keep Mick. Bob Weston went on to play in a few other bands, release some blues stuff, and in 2012, his friends called the police when they were concerned that they hadn't heard from him in a while. When the police entered his home, they found him dead at 64 years old. The canceling of the tour after the Weston affair was a big deal financially. They had a lot of legal obligations to play and would be heavily penalized if they didn't. So, their manager hired a new group of musicians, called them Fleetwood Mac, and sent them on stage to perform.
Literally just new people.
Yep. It's just like, all right, you need Fleetwood Mac to play. I'll just make a new Fleetwood Mac and send them out there to play.
That's truly insane.
The manager said, quote, "We're going to play that tour even if I have to assemble a band myself and have them perform as Fleetwood Mac."
That's
quote.
So ridiculous. Can you imagine having a ticket to see a band and then it's like, haha, here they are. What?
For a while, this new band actually stopped the real Fleetwood Mac from releasing music under that name, because this new Fleetwood Mac was also signed to Warner Brothers, and the manager said that he owned the Fleetwood Mac name.
This is wild.
So it started a long legal battle that eventually let Fleetwood Mac use their name again, and they fired their manager, understandably. Bob Welch, who at this point was the band's only guitarist, was basically running the group with Mick, and he realized that Warner Brothers was not prioritizing them and suggested that they relocate to LA. They then put out an album that broke into the top 40 of the US charts for the first time, but ultimately wasn't very successful after that. Following their tour for that album, Bob Welch said, quote, "I was totally exhausted by writing, singing, touring, negotiating, moving, and frankly, so were Mick, John, and Christine. We were all discouraged that Heroes hadn't done better. Something needs to change, but what? There was also a kind of fatigue, anger, and bitterness that all the work we had done hadn't really paid off. And we were just all sort of shaking our heads saying, what do we do now? Everybody knew that we had to find some new creative juice. Mick Fleetwood was in the studio when an engineer played him a song that he'd recorded from a band called Buckingham Nicks. Mick loved it, and the guitarist Lindsey Buckingham happened to be in the studio recording demos. So Mick met him. Mick asked Lindsey to join the group, and he agreed on the condition that his girlfriend and music partner, Stevie Nicks, could also join.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll leave it for now.
Yeah.
We're about to get into the rumors era.
Yeah.
Fleetwood Mac, which everyone knows so well.